Hi, welcome to The Forum. I'm Sean O'Brien. The Forum's a program where we look at things that come up in our lives and in our culture and go to the Bible to see how Christians should respond to them. Today we have with us Andy Bird, the televangelist. I know you love that.
Yes.
And Mike Mitchell, the pastor of Westlake Community Church in Saratoga Springs.
Saratoga Eagle Mountain.
Saratoga Eagle Mountain area. And today's topic is going to be adoption. And adoption is a pretty big issue around the world. There's probably millions of children who don't have parents and will not have parents unless someone steps in. They're going to be in orphanages that may not be the best place to live in. And Christians who are supposed to step in and help take care of widows and orphans and people in need have historically been pretty interested in adoption. So we're going to get into that topic today. So let's go ahead and give us some background from the Bible, from Christian history. Why is adoption important to Christianity? Go ahead and start us off, Andy.
Well, I think it's the first and foremost reason that it's important is because there's several times in the Bible where God actually talks about Him being the father to the fatherless, right? Which is us. So He adopted us as sons and daughters into His kingdom. The sacrifice that was paid on the cross was for us, and in there is all these adoptive metaphors and the taking up of us as orphans, being apart from Him in our sin, separate from God as He redeems us. There is this whole adoptive mentality that goes on. But then it goes a step further within the Bible, and it talks about as a requirement of something that we should be doing. You look at James 1:27, which is one of those verses that really hit you, and there's a reason why it was written the way it was written. It says, "For the religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted from the world." The irony about that verse is Christians, when most people view Christians from the outside looking in, what they see is Christians trying to keep themselves from being polluted from the world.
Not the first part.
Not the first part. And that's a struggle, I think, for us, and I think it's a struggle for the church as a whole, to not have that mentality. And so what you end up with is a church that, as a whole, and again, there are some churches I'm sure that are greater than this than others, that don't do a lot in that. So the Bible, uses that metaphor for that adopted for our salvation. It compels us to do it, but yet the church as a whole doesn't do as much there. We don't get that view from the outside, but we try to get the view from not being polluted. So it's a struggle, I think, as a whole. And I think from a Christian standpoint, I think it's one of the more paramount things, not only from a witnessing standpoint, but from a self-growing in knowing the Lord better, and striving and doing more for Him, not for works-based righteousness, but because He loved us so much that He adopted us, that we would, and not everybody, we were talking earlier, not everybody's fit to adopt. It's not an easy thing.
Sure.
But we should be contributing, and we should be moving that direction. We should be prayerfully thinking about that.
All right, jumping ahead a little bit.
Sorry, that's why I stopped. I didn't want to go too far.
Mike, anything to add? Adoption in the Bible? Do we see this?
Yeah, I mean, as Andy said, this is fundamental to the whole worldview of the Bible. The whole picture of God and the relationship between God and people is really characterized by this process of adoption. And we are orphans. We have alienated ourselves from God and live as orphan children, and through Christ, God adopts us into His family. And that's specifically the metaphor that Paul uses in his letter to the Galatians. It says that now you are brought in, you're given full rights as sons. So it's very distinct and very fundamental. And I definitely agree with everything Andy said. This is part and parcel of who we are as Christians. And again, it doesn't mean that every Christian has a mandate to adopt a child. Not everybody is in that situation. Not everyone's called to be a parent. Not every Christian is called to be married. But that being said, it should be, I often like to say, helping people who are in situations like orphan children. It should be for Christians what putting out fires is to firemen. It's just what we do. It's not anything unusual.
That's a great one.
And one thing that is actually, my wife and I have 3 adopted children that we adopted from underdeveloped countries. And one thing that has frustrated me among Christians, and not people that don't believe in Christ, but among Christians with whom I worship and go to church, is not always, but often I've had the response when I first told people, say when we were first going through the process of, wow, that's really extraordinary, or that's such a great thing, what a good deed that you're doing. And that frustrates me because that's not extraordinary, and it shouldn't be anything unusual, because again, that should just be who we are and what we do. That's precisely the type of life that Jesus calls us to live, to look out for those who are the least of these, and those who are in need and have no other people to help them. One thing that's consistent with that, and I think has always been a really meaningful aspect of church history to me, is Rodney Stark has a book called The Triumph of Christianity, and before that he has one called The Rise of Christianity. I think it was in the first one, where he talks about the disproportionate number of women in the early church in the 2nd and 3rd century. If you did a demographic study of Christianity in the ancient Mediterranean world, there was a disproportionate number of women to men. And he's a sociologist, and he just asked the question, why is that? What's responsible? What made for this large number of women among Christian circles? And one of the things he points to that was the greatest factor in that is that in the Roman world, sons, as is the case in other cultures today, were most desirable.
Right.
And if a woman gave birth to a daughter, it was not seen often as a positive thing. It was seen much more as a liability than an asset. And the father was well within his legal rights to dispose of that child, because the daughter was just not something that was seen to be of value to the family. So it was a common thing for a Roman father to take a newborn girl and set her in a clay jar or container of some sort and put her out on the street next to the garbage can, or to take the child out into the woods and just leave it to die of exposure. And the reason why, says Rodney Stark, there were so many women in the 2nd and 3rd century in Christianity is because it was the Christians who came by and considered it their duty to rescue those girls.
Right.
And they were the ones that came by to take those those newborn children, adopt them into their families, raise them, and in the course of a generation or two, the number of women swelled in the church because of that. And that's just one picture of the type of life that Christians are called to live. So yeah, I would totally agree with Andy that this is not anything for Christians. Certainly, there are many people who are not Christians that adopt, and that's a fine thing. But for Christians, this is just everyday life. This is business as usual. This is not anything extraordinary.
Yeah, it shouldn't be.
Sure.
But yeah, like you're saying, the reality of it is people still look at it and say, wow.
Right. It's another good way to say it is that, and this is what frustrates me, is that it's treated in the church like a niche interest. You have some churches, some large churches that have, which is a wonderful thing. They have an auto mechanic ministry where they have men who are skilled mechanics in the church, and they come together maybe once a month and provide free service for single moms or whoever, and that's wonderful. But that's a niche interest. Not everybody is going to be into auto mechanics, so that makes sense. But helping orphan children is not a niche interest. Again, it's just central to who we are.
Yeah, amen.
So let's get down into kind of nitty-gritty. Let's look at the everyday Christian. Let's look at what the Bible says and see what's the best practice for us here. So it's one thing for a Christian to come across a baby in a jar on the side of the road and picking up that child. Is it another thing to go out and search for an adopted child across the world? So in one case, there's not a lot of upfront cost. In the second case, in our modern times, it is kind of expensive to adopt a child. Is that the best use of our resources as ministers of the gospel to adopt one child? Or maybe should that money be invested into foreign orphanages or something that may be more bang for your buck, so to speak? Andy?
So it's an interesting pragmatic question. An international. So I have one child who's been adopted internationally, and it is extremely expensive. Absolutely, 100%. I'd say if you can invest in that, there's no better place for your money to go. I also believe that we should also be contributing to those orphanages. But there's levels, right? And so when you look at it from a pragmatic standpoint, you say, I can help greater good by investing in an orphanage internationally. Let's take DR Congo, for example, because that's near and dear to my heart, because that's where my boy's from. And I could invest in that orphanage, and I should, and every Christian should. But I think the distinctive that you have there isn't whether we should do this or that, it's what we're called to do. Since we're all called to take care of orphans, those that can adopt should adopt, and those that can't adopt should invest. And where I have the biggest point of contention on this is we are not giving. This is why we have parachurch ministries that are doing all the work, and even the church isn't giving to those parachurch ministries enough, right? There's some, but we're talking about 0.001% of their budgets. I mean, these low amounts. So you have parachurch ministries coming up, and then you have political factions coming up who are stepping in because they're going, there's a need, and it's all because of our deficit. I would love for me to show stats against this, but it's the deficit of Christians participating in this area that other organizations have had to step up, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, as well as governmental and other political structures and organizations have stepped up to try to fulfill those needs. So I would say it's both. I don't think it's one or the other, and it is expensive. And when you look at it, when you're comparing something pragmatically for the greatest good, here's always my question. It's usually not those two things that come up. It's usually, does the church invest in a building, or does the church invest in an orphanage or a home in Haiti or whatever it might be? Those are usually the dichotomies that get presented. It's typically not, well, do we give to the orphanage or that? So like I said, I think that it's a prayerful consideration because it is so expensive, but I don't know what other better use of my money I could have ever spent, because my hope is that at least for the child that I adopted, is I believe I know where he was headed. It was either early death or out on the streets at some point, no matter what I did. With the orphanage there, unfortunately, because of governmental structures, has been shut down. So the way the orphanage works now is a bunch of homes, and they're cared for that way. And so no amount of investing could have even helped in that regard, but bringing him out and giving him other opportunity to hopefully go and not only teach him the ways of the Lord and pointing him in the right direction, hopefully he will now be an influence, and that'll have a generational impact. That's my best hope, and that we honored the Lord every way we went. So,
Mike, anything to add? Adopting kids or moving out to Africa and running an orphanage?
You talked about the expense and the question of would it be better, and I'll just use my own experience as a, just as a reference point. As I said, my wife and I have adopted 3 children, 2 from Haiti and 1 from Ukraine, in a pretty impoverished region in Ukraine. And that was over the course of about 5 years to adopt all 3 children. And in terms of just the direct expense, legal cost, adoption fees, government fees on the other side, travel and so forth, it was in the ballpark for all 3 children about $40,000. Now,
all 3 together?
All 3 together, yeah. It was about.
That's a good deal.
Yeah, it is.
Mine was 40 for just one.
Just one, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's different from the country and the time, and sometimes if you adopt one year, it's different than the other year. So, but just as a figure, okay, this is a sum of financial investment that has been a part of our lives. And a lot of people, and this again troubles me, I think it's just a matter of perspective, a lot of people would hear that number and say, oh, there's no way we could go in debt for $40,000. How many people do we know, and maybe ourselves included, have financed a car for them?
I was just going to say, yep.
Or, and it may be the case where, you're in a position where you could be eligible with your level of credit to get a mortgage for your home, or you could finance an adoption. And if you finance an adoption, you're going to have to rent indefinitely. Well, rent. There's a child's life at stake. And certainly if we ask ourselves what's more consistent, what's characteristic of the life that Jesus called us to live, not that mortgages are bad, but when you compare those to adopting a child, there's no real contest there. Another thing that Andy said that I think is just so important, this is the one point, or one of the points that my wife and I just want to shout from the rooftops in light of our experience. Yeah. And specifically talking about adopting children in the third world.
Okay.
He talked about the impact and what the type of life, the quality of life, or lack thereof, that his son would have experienced had he not been adopted. That is so huge, and you know, it's easy sometimes to oversimplify things like this and to maybe exaggerate a little bit. But this is not an oversimplification, and it's not by any means an exaggeration. There are millions of children who, this very moment, are eligible to be adopted, and if they are not adopted, will almost certainly die in childhood from some disease that we have probably never heard of because we've never known anyone to be affected by it because we have the technology to prevent it, or a girl who's basically forced into prostitution or sold into sex slavery, or lives some sort of just incredibly impoverished life, physically, spiritually, mentally impoverished life, children that would never be educated and so forth. And whether or not a child lives that quality of life or lives in a home with a mom and a dad that loves him or her and teaches the child about Christ and grows up getting education and being a child and living life, there's one thing on which those two qualities of life rest, and that's the decision of somebody to adopt that child.
Yeah.
Now again, that doesn't mean that every person is supposed to adopt, and that should not be used to manipulate people emotionally into adoption, for sure. But there are some people who are thinking, you know, we could do that. You know, we have one child and we want to have a large family one day, but I don't know because the expense, and we're already tight, and would the child, you know, be able to relate to our child we have already? And I've heard horror stories of children coming from third world environments and having a lot of emotional problems. Well, you know, that person has a decision to make, and you know, what rides on that decision is this radically different life for this child.
Yeah.
And that's black and white, and that's brass tacks. I mean, that either that child's going to die or be sold into slavery or whatever, or that child's going to grow up in a healthy, nurturing family. And it all comes down to what that parent decides to do, that potential parent.
So can I just add to that, because
Yeah.
I think it's important to add to that, that he touched on sacrifice.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to try to say this in the nicest way possible. Whenever I think of a sacrifice, of an inconvenience in my life, and I'm doing it for the Lord, if you want to even call it that, which it hasn't been, it's been a blessing for us to adopt, but I just look to the cross. I mean, listen, I'm so far from Jesus, it's amazing. I mean, he was who he was, and I am who I am, and I'm very far removed. But the sacrifice the things that I can give up, whether it's a car, whether it's just the conveniences, we sometimes as American Christians, looking at sacrifice is a scary thing. Yeah. And adoption is sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of my time, it's a sacrifice of my monetary resources, it's a sacrifice of emotion. It can be a sacrifice of all those things. At the same time, it's a blessing too. So we look at it with all the negative impact, and so we can poo-poo it, right, for lack of a better term, and there are plenty of them. But we can poo-poo it because it's difficult, but I think we're called to do those difficult things reading the Bible as many times as I have.
Absolutely. And I want to interject to that too. And this is something that I think, again, in our very comfortable, highly technologically advanced, sanitized society, it is so easy for Christians to lose sight of this. And that's probably one of the major concerns people have, especially adopting internationally, and this is more so the older the child is. That again, what if we already have children, and will this child be able to relate? And I've heard horror stories of, you know, the child having emotional difficulties and being abusive and causing just turmoil in the family and wreaking all this havoc in the household. Mm-hmm. And what needs to be said to that person is, yes, that's a possibility.
Yep.
In fact, you might get to the country in a place like the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Haiti, and you might get kidnapped or killed.
Yep.
And when you get the child back, the child might have extreme emotional difficulties and make your life very, very painful and uncomfortable. That's not really the point. Jesus calls us to make a difference in the lives of other people and to serve the least of these, regardless of what it means for us. And you know, we look at, as Andy said, the example of Christ. Where would we all be if Christ said, I will come down and serve you and save you and love you, as long as I can be comfortable in the process, and as long as there's no vulnerability on my part, and as long as I'm not putting anything up for loss in that sense. So, you know, this concept of abandonment, where as Paul says in Acts, I believe it's in Acts 20, when he tells the Ephesian elders, I consider my life worth nothing to me if only I can complete the race and the task that God has given me of testifying to the gospel of his grace. Well, that's the attitude we have to have, and not just with adopting children, but in everything that we do in serving Christ, and saying, look, yes, there are many bad things that could come of this, but we know that this is what God has called us to do, so we're going to do it no matter what. And maybe we'll die, maybe we won't, but we're going to do this because it's what he calls us to do. We're going to hope for the best and work for the best, but whatever the case, we've got to be obedient.
Mm-hmm. Well, this, for your average American, and probably your average American Christian, despite what you've been saying earlier, this still sounds like something radical, because this is so far outside the normal experience of Americans. There are plenty of people out there who won't or will limit the amount of biological children that they'll have just to preserve a certain standard of living, right, and to step outside of that and to do something that can be even more traumatic. Like one of the things I was going to bring up was there's a report on a TV news program like 60 Minutes or 2020 about a year ago about rehoming, something that's become more prominent as more and more people have adopted, at least here in North America, that people get these kids, they have the horror stories, and then they go on Craigslist, list the kid, and try to get rid of them. What is a Christian's obligation? I mean, you can have these horrible things happen, you think you just can't handle it anymore. When you adopt, what is your obligation? What are you signing up for?
Hebrews 13:16. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So I'm going to take that verse and let's expand it out a little bit. We don't have to delve into, every single word there, but the general sense of that word is there. Listen, if I go and marry my wife, when I married my wife, I did not know all the impact, the troubles, and all those things that I have. At that point in time, that's why things like divorce are rampant and things, things like that. This has become inconvenient for me. This has become a struggle for me. That's not what I'm called to do. I'm called to make a commitment. And there are going to be difficulties across the board. And so when you look at things like adoption, and I've heard plenty of stories on the rehoming, and plus there's now whole groups that are against adoption, which they really don't know their impact when they say such things. And by the way, the adoption rate in the U.S. is declining right now. Yeah. Internationally. It's not increasing. Again, that falls, I hate to say this, Christians, it falls on our shoulders when that happens. And so we are trying to maintain this level of life that we are not called to maintain. And some of us have extraordinary conveniences, myself included. And so adding to something that might burden, even if it's difficult, even if it causes strife within the family, isn't a means or a reason for us to step away and to go rehome it. I think this is one of the core struggles with this. If you are led, and you believe you are led to adopt, then you must go forward with that to its fullest extent. Mm-hmm. You really do. And when I say fullest extent, that means that you're either deceived yourself that you weren't in the first place, which, if that's the case, you have bigger questions to answer than whether or not the child should stay in your home. Mm-hmm. That would be, I don't mean to be that black and white, but I mean to be that black and white.
Yeah, one thing I would tag onto that too, you mentioned divorce. And I think this is so important to most of the topics that are discussed here on the forum, that we step back and look at the bigger picture and the way of thinking, the philosophy that lies behind the different beliefs and positions that people have on certain issues. And this is, I think, equally true for the issue of divorce and for people who are very hesitant and very uncertain about adoption. It's often because, as is so true in so many parts of our culture, in fact, I think our culture is characterized by this, a philosophy which says the purpose of my life, the central fundamental goal and reason for my existence is my own immediate happiness. Mm-hmm. And that's why, again, in a marriage, if you've been in a marriage for a period of time and you're just not happy, then you look at an option that will remedy that, because that's the main purpose you exist, for which you exist, is to be happy and to secure that immediate comfort. Yeah. How many people have you heard say, well, we just weren't happy anymore? So, well, same thing with adoption. Well, I'm afraid that if I were to adopt a child with the monetary expense and the the vulnerability for making upheaval in the household. I'm afraid it would diminish my happiness. Well, then don't adopt if that's what life is really about your own personal happiness. But as Christians, we know that that's not the purpose of our life, and the purpose of our life is to serve other people the way that Jesus has served us and the way that Jesus has loved us. And of course, the wonderful thing is that the people who follow Christ's example and give of themselves with no concern for their own happiness, in the end, wind up being happier than anybody else. But that's not our goal. Our goal is to love other people like Christ loved us. And if that's your underlying philosophy, it totally changes the way you think about it.
Well, we've got 2 minutes, so make this practical. Someone sees this program, maybe it tugs on their heart a little bit, they want to be involved somehow. What do? Quick.
They need to reach out first and foremost to, there's plenty of Christian organizations, especially with Haiti. In fact, Haiti was one of the first places we wanted to adopt from, and due to circumstances had to adopt from DR Congo, which we were blessed with. But there's plenty of organizations they should be reaching out to ask how they can help. That is the first and foremost, because there's always a financial need for many of these organizations. There's plenty of children that need to be adopted, and so I would say that's the very first thing, is go do the research, find a local area, local good Christian organization that's doing adoptions, and get involved.
Mike, how do you know that you're called to be involved?
I would say if you're called to be a parent.
Yeah.
It's because some people don't have kids, and some people aren't wired to be parents. I think that's, as I said earlier, true about marriage. Some people, contrary to what a lot of Christians think, some people, like Paul, like the Apostle Paul, are not called to be married. And that's fine, and that's good. But if you know that you want to be a parent, and that you are called to love and raise children, then you should seriously, if you're a Christian, seriously think about adoption. Now, that doesn't mean that you must, or you have to, or you may not be in a situation still that allows you to, but it's still something that you should support to some extent, and at least give some consideration. And one last thing I would say, just to reiterate, is that if there is a couple, if there is someone out there who's genuinely thinking about it and thought, I thought about this before, but I'm not really sure, understand that it is a fact that there is a child in the third world somewhere who is in a country, in a situation where he or she can be adopted. And the entire quality of that child's life, whether or not he or she will hear about Christ, whether or not he or she will die from cholera in childhood.
Or eat.
Or eat at all, correct. Whether or not that child will be able to read. This might be a potential surgeon, a potential PhD, who knows. Whether or not that's the life the child lives, or the child grows up in a loving Christian family, all depends on that person's decision as to whether or not he or she's going to adopt.
Well, thanks, guys. There's a lot for Christians to think about here. What are your priorities? How are you going to sacrifice to follow Jesus? You need to think about if you want to be involved in something like this and how to do it. You can contact us at the forum at forumtv20@gmail.com, or look at our videos at YouTube, youtube.com/forumtv20. Thanks for watching.